Welcome to Education Perspectives. I am your host, Liza Holland. This is a podcast that explores the role of education in our society from a variety of lenses. Education needs to evolve to meet the needs of today and the future. Solving such huge issues requires understanding. Join me as we begin to explore the many perspectives of education. Barbara Smith is a passionate educator who challenges the boundaries of sameness in schools. Smith's background includes over 40 years in public, charter, independent, and international schools. Barbara has started 3 schools and has been a teacher, principal, consultant, trustee, and teacher educator at OISE, McGill, and the University of Saskatchewan, teaching faculties and graduate schools. She has published many books through Rowman and Littlefield and Brill publishers. So, Barb Smith, welcome. We are so glad to have you on Education Perspectives.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Well, I will kick you off with the big one. From a 30,000-foot view, why do you think that we as a society invest in education?
Well, yeah, that's a big question for sure, and an important one that not many people make time to think about. And so I think it's an incredible question, and I'll tell you why. I think it's for 2 reasons. The first is I think we need to invest in 2 key things that affect everything else in education. And one is critical thinking. And it's very interesting because the title of your podcast is Education Perspectives. Intelligence has a lot to do with your capacity to understand different perspectives in order to make informed decisions about what you do in school and what schools do for society. So from that big picture kind of question, you're asking about society. So we need critical thinkers, and we need critical thinkers because you can't be compassionate without having a critical understanding of different perspectives. I mean, that's pretty important. And the more people have fixed views about things, the more difficult it is to really be an intelligent society. And so fixed views are not a healthy thing for a society. So if you're a critical thinker, you don't just stand by a fixed view, you have an understanding of alternate views. And I think that that's pretty important. And in this day and age, when peace is something that shouldn't just be a word, it should be something we're striving for, we really can't get there without having societies that can critically think. And the second part of that, my kind of more big, I guess, bird's eye view from 30,000 feet up, is that we need creative thinkers and doers and makers. And it's really important because the emphasis right now happens to be on testing and memorizing answers to the past. And we need creative thinkers so that we actually can handle the present and certainly work in the present industriously. But we need to be able to solve tomorrow's problems that aren't on page 37 in a textbook, or they're not a multiple choice option on a accountability test. So those 2 things are the reasons we need to invest in education. However, I'm not sure that those are the areas that education is investing in. And that is a concern. Nevertheless, you need to invest in things that you value. And we really can't afford not to have an educated society if humanity is going to be sustainable. I think that's pretty important.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And you gave me so much juicy information for follow-up questions. But I do want to take just a little minute and kind of dive into your perspective on education and how you've arrived there. What drew you to education, and tell us a little bit about your journey?
Well, I think at first I enjoyed helping people. And I know lots of us in education feel the same way. It does feel good to help someone else. And again, I'm not sure we create enough of experiences like that in school for, even young people to have those opportunities. So, it does draw me to service learning. So things I would do outside of school, I would try to say, how is this critical thinking and creative thinking in school to have service learning projects, either at the school or at the school level, the community level, or even globally, if there's a disaster and what can our students rally behind to try and make a difference? And in trying to help others, you come to have a deeper understanding of the world. And I think the great thing about education is that you should learn about a world outside your own, and that allows you to grow. And if you don't learn about anything outside your own life and what you experience, then it may not be as a fulfilling life as it could be. So I think that, what drew me to education is that kind of really very simply, wanting to help others. And as an educator, I really enjoyed working, with students to create projects together, not just to deliver a project or train the students. These are words that don't really involve students having any say. and so certainly what draws me to them is to be able to do creative things with students and to excite them about, where they can go with it. And so, if I had some wonderful mentors in my own career, I want to be that for other people too, so that their voice feels that it matters and that they have a say, and they're not just technicians, handing out a curriculum that somebody outside a classroom has made for them and the test that someone outside the classroom has made for them to deliver. This is really not the democratic ideals that I value. And I think that only through democracy can you have innovation, and can you have a society that can support one another. So that question that's what drew me to education. I felt this was the best platform to be able to try and, certainly help others, certainly have some autonomy and have some say in how they get to grow in their lives.
Well, that is a great segue to the root of this podcast, which is really around student agency. And I'm so glad that you talked a little bit about kind of that what we're measuring for is not necessarily what we really want. The pace of change is happening so fast. And realistically, as you said, we need critical and creative thinkers who can process content as opposed to putting the focus on the content. It really needs to switch to this process. And part of the magic of that is really digging into student agency and having students in responsible roles, because the reality is it's no longer, we don't live in a world where you can have your school and be done with it. You have to be a lifelong learner because things are changing. What we're teaching in school today could be completely obsolete by the time they actually get out in the work world and start using it. So tell me a little bit about this new book, Urgent Care for Schools and Students in Responsible Roles.
Well, it started when I did my graduate research years ago. And of course, what sort of inspired me to research the topic was peer teaching. When students were given very deliberate, very systematic experiences where they would be able to go and learn by teaching is basically what it was about. And you see lots of documents out there that says the highest form of learning is teaching. And the teacher in a classroom typically talks the most. And because the teacher is talking using the subject matter, they're becoming more and more and more expert at it. So I focused a lot on linguistics and what was actually happening when the students were teaching the other students. And at first in the peer teaching research, I noticed that the students, they were grade 4 students, very young, being teachers of younger kids, they wanted to sort of mimic how they were taught, which is a very teacher-directed mode. So at first they would have a clipboard, and they would at first they think, well, I'd have to take attendance for 10 minutes, and then I'll have to do this, and then I'll have to. I was like, whoa. So I realized that the things I was teaching at the Faculty of Education at the University of Toronto, I went, okay, how do I create a program for these grade 4 peer teachers so that they're actually designing, at the time, it was multi-intelligence lesson plans. So different ways to be able to go and to be able to reach as many students as possible in a classroom with what they were trying to teach. So it was exciting because I saw something happen when students who may, in their regular grade 4 class, they may have this kind of pecking order where everybody kind of knows that this person is usually getting higher scores on tests than this person, and so on. So there is this implicit understanding amongst kids as young as grade 4 for sure, and even younger, I'm sure, that some are supposedly are brighter than others. And we turned that on its head a bit, because when the students got to teach younger students, they left that baggage behind. So the younger students didn't know about this bell curve or this identity issue that the students had in their own setting. But when they went and taught younger students, they excelled in many, many ways. So they were able to teach things that at first the teacher would have been surprised, their own homeroom teacher was surprised that they had the capacity to teach what they were teaching. But when they didn't have a ranking system in place, it allowed them to take risks, to learn from their mistakes, but to really excel. So it jumbled up the supposedly achievement charts that they would have when they were actually presenting what they were doing in their classrooms. And I don't say presenting, it's probably not the greatest word, because they had to create interactive situations where the students would go to centers and they would work with them in mini lessons at centers and so on. And they were trying to do the most informed kind of practices, as opposed to maybe the traditional conventional practices with the teachers at the front of the room and kind of dictating what has to be done. So many of them got to learn the way they like to learn. So I guess I was at a conference in Alberta about a month ago, and they had 16 panel members, and they were students. And it was really interesting because it had nothing to do with my research. My research was years and years ago, decades ago. But they all spoke about the precious memory making times they had in school. And a few of them talked about being buddies or helping teach another student how to do something. When they talked about that, they lit up. And that was the same findings that I'd had years ago. So that drove me to say, okay, I never took time to publish the research. And I said, okay, so that will be one chapter out of, I think there's 25 chapters. That will be one chapter that will now be dedicated to sharing those findings. So people know that it's worth the time investment. And time is just as I'm going to probably talk about that quite a bit. That's the issue. You have to make time to make memories. And if you plug it all up with 85 different expectations, let's say in language arts in grade 4, there's no time to give these kids the opportunity to peer teach younger kids. And we also did a peer teaching where we taught up. So the grade 4s went into a grade 7 class and taught them how to figure out the area of a triangle. Now, this is a very tough concept for grade 7s. It's a separator on those standardized tests, but we had grade 4s going in and teaching it to them. So not only was it an enrichment concept for all these grade 4 kids, the grade 7 kids paid more attention. And when they wound up doing their standardized tests later on, it was, all of a sudden that one separating concept in math was mastered by this particular class. So you don't always have to teach younger material. When you can also do it in another direction. And a lot of people don't think about peer teaching in that way. But it doesn't just have to be formalized lessons, where this research was over 3 months. They became teachers. So they really took the time, just like a lot of teachers in teacher education. So that drew me to look at it. But then I discovered there are a lot of other ways that students were responsible. Students become action researchers. So they actually say why they, in one of my schools, like, okay, we want to change the schedule and we want more recess, and I said, well, okay, well, you better do some research about this. So away you go. And when the students came up with a very viable reason to want to make some policy changes, let's say in the school that I was a principal at, I would say, okay, well, bring it in and I want you to present it to the staff, and maybe we'll present it to the board, depending on, how significant the change is and how many permissions are needed to do it. But I found out they were, again, when they were something other than a student doing tests, they all of a sudden were engaged and were doing a lot more deeper thinking and learning than in the traditional textbook oriented kind of program. So then I found out there was other students who were doing service learning in big ways, lots of different ways. So I captured a lot of stories all over the world from different things people were doing, and really listening to their quotes and what they said about how so it's not just through my voice, you get to hear that this is important, but this particular book, it does have a lot of pieces to it. The idea of internships in high school. Why are they only in practical arts? Or even the question came up, why is there a separation between practical arts and academics? Why do people there's a lot that goes into redesigning someone's bathroom. And when you have your students go out there, and the math that's involved and everything else that they're doing is very applied. And I think that, a lot of these experiences kind of blur the lines between some things that you traditionally think, well, we're going to give people these technical skills and off they go. And then we're going to give people these academic skills. But you can't deeply understand an academic concept unless you apply it. And I would say robotics is the one area that has thrown a wrench into the whole system. Because are you going to say that's a practical art? Because it is. But no, it's an application of physics and math. And when you talk about computer science, that's an application of patterning in math. So we need to not just assume that the way schools and subjects and everything else was designed and what we give people to, as their curriculum. How different is it, since 1950? And it should be, because the world is very different than 1950. And I'm sad to say that it has more similarities to 1950 than it should. And I think our kids, what they're doing is they're building tunnels under us because they want to situate their own responsibility. They want to matter. They want to do something that really will make a difference. So yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to get that book out there to say, these aren't soft skills. Lose the word soft.
Yeah.
These are essential skills. And you can have all the memorized know-how in the world, but if you don't have the critical thinking to do something with it, to make some meaning with it, and if you can't create answers or you can't create solutions to problems that don't exist, then we're really not preparing our young people for a society that, is going to be helpful. We're going to have to be doing a lot of backpedaling. And the more, the more testing tends to be the goal versus learning, the more, our schools are not generally preparing kids for what they need to do in the future.
Even that piece about failure and finding new ways to do things, it's not consistent with this. You got to get an A culture that we have developed here. And I've been doing a lot of work in the career and technical education space. And that connection, that kind of career connected learning sort of idea, to blend that in makes so much more sense in what we're doing today, because unfortunately, the old system, when you talk to business and industry, we're not producing kids with those skill sets that we've been talking about already: problem solvers, critical thinkers, good communicators. So it really is incumbent upon us to make a change. One of the things that I loved in just reading the synopsis, your book is not out as of a time of recording, but was the fact that you have so many different co-authors from all over the world. Anything that you kind of want to particularly highlight there that when we get the book in our hands, we need to make sure to not miss?
Wow. Well, it's interesting because when you give students responsibilities, you create scenarios. You don't give anybody knowledge. You don't give them these things. You sort of set a context in place where they can generate their capacities. And when you mentioned about internships, it made me think too, there's a whole chapter about apprenticeship. And these are examples of students who have been doing one of the chapters on entrepreneurial studies. And so they wound up creating a school restaurant, and they had to do, it wasn't as fun as, putting up a few posters and saying, and then everybody came and eat, and then, oh, isn't that wonderful? There's a detailing of any kind of business and the learning curves of startups and so on. So this was a wonderful, I learned so much by reading what people were doing. Now, I reached out specifically to, when I'm looking at comments on LinkedIn, or I've been following what certain schools have been doing that I think are real maverick schools. These schools are taking risks with time because they're repurposing how time is being distributed. They're also repurposing roles that teachers have. And this particular book really focuses on not just the students. There were many students wrote their own chapters, but there were facilitators. And these are the adults in the school that said, wait a minute, let's make room, because they played a very important role. And some of the chapters, the Changemaker chapter, for example, from Frankfurt, Germany, the school there, the administrator and the student wrote the chapter together about an event that they had put on for the students in the school and what it involved. So I can't, there's so many that are so unique. And, even a teacher telling the story of being a camp counselor and how a story like that seems so distant from teacher preparation. And, when you read that heartfelt story, they formed a relationship with those kids in the summer, and that made a difference in how they felt about themselves. But look at the number. They had 8 students. And people will say, oh, well, it's a quality of the curriculum and the quality of the teacher. You can put as many kids in a classroom as you can. No, you can't. If we had, I don't know, if we had all my authors on here at the same time, we wouldn't have this relationship and this conversation we are having now. And Vygotsky is a real important figure in educational theory, and basically said, it's a social situation for learning, and you've got to, the more people you have to share time with, the less you get to elaborate on what you know. So that's why the tutoring industry is going crazy, because first of all, it's impossible for 25 kids in a classroom to really all be able to master what it is to be learned. So they need to go elsewhere for that. So that's created a whole new industry. But secondly, they haven't been able to form those relationships either. So the student may know they're not getting it, but the teacher has to rely on some outside standardized test to know whether they know. That camp counselor with those 8 kids knows if they should be swimming without a life jacket when it's swim time. That counselor knows all of those things. So there's something about learning and teaching that, we have a lot to learn that are outside the walls of a school. So education, according to Dewey, is everything that happens in life. So parents play a big role. And if parents, really don't understand that testing is not really testing what is valued and what society will value and needs, then they're going to continue to push for, buying real estate near a school that got some high score on a test, which is not going to guarantee that their child will, be excited about learning and education and will do anything with that education. And that's a bit of a myth buster that is really hard to do something about. So, I try to say, how can I share my experiences and others' experiences so that parents can have a deeper sense of what an education is. And it's pretty hard to measure critical and creative thinking. And because it's so hard to measure, it's not being measured. And are we putting the right people in the right place on the bus when they get to graduate school? Something to think about. And who are making these decisions in the future? They're people who are very compliant and they do as they're told.
Well, they came through our industrial model system. They're exactly what we wanted in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Not so much today.
True. Yeah.
Gosh. Well, that's exciting. I look forward to reading that. And I also am excited to hear that students actually got an opportunity to contribute or actually write some of their own in there, because I do think that it's a massive paradigm shift for teachers, right? They go through this old model and then they go to school where they were taught the old model and, that they were supposed to be the expert in everything. And it's a little scary to try to give kids agency the way we're talking about, right? And so it seems to me that your book will provide them a lot of context and maybe some ways that they had not thought about for how they might be able to empower kids. I'd love to get your thoughts on, because I have been doing a bunch of work interviewing teachers, and the overall constant amongst all of them, we were doing a deeper learning cohort, was the value of time and the fact that we have put so many things on a plate of teachers that they don't have time to sit back and think critically and problem solve themselves to be able to introduce this new learning. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts around that aspect of it.
Well, this is exactly, and it's such an important point that you're making, is that how can we expect students to be critical and creative thinkers if our teachers can't model it and are not permitted to model it? And there were a time when schools could design their own report cards. Oh, how dare they? Well, what does that mean? If you think about it, if you unpack that, what you're saying is we trust the educators in that building. They have an education and they have been professionally learning, and they're using their context with the students that they know best to design these particular tools. And most people that have this assumption when they say, but they all have to be the same so they can be compared. And what if they go to another school and it's a different kind of report card? Oh, what will happen? Well, I don't think much will happen at all. I mean, I think that the students are getting feedback about what they're learning from the people who know them best. And I think that is something that we need to think about. Now, the assumption is that if all report cards have to be the same, then all students are the same.
Yeah. And that is so not true. Nope.
And so the sameness is, and there's time, and then there's sameness. This is this force that's pushing a lot of the things, and that's not helping, because I'll go back to something that is very disturbing, and that's when you have school shootings. And I always ask myself, I always go back and say, how many kids were at that school? I want to know. So Marjorie Stone and Douglas, sure enough, thousands of kids. Now, can that principal know every single kid in that school? Not a
at
chance.
The level that you'd like for them to. Nope.
But if this is a community, whoever's the head of the food chain there should be able to know not only every kid, but every parent. Okay. So that is broken for sure. And if somebody said about Sandy Hook, they said, oh, well, that's a small school. I said, do you know where the shooter came from? Well, how many kids were at his school? He was a disenfranchised youth. So that kid needed to find meaning in a very destructive way, because there was no constructive opportunities that really presented themselves in their particular schools. And there's no excuse for, if you can't do good, you can do harm. There's no reason that should happen. But we have to look at what we can control in schools. We can't just say, oh, that's a cycle of violence, not my problem. Oh, that's a cycle of poverty, not my problem. We have these kids for 6 hours a day. They're not our problems. There are opportunities, and we have to talk about things we can control. We can control how many kids are in a classroom. Yes, we can. And educators know, I've been a principal, I've started 3 schools. I can control that I can have less than 20 kids in a class. I can try and aim for 15 or 14. That's ideal. That's the way I try to work it when I'm in schools. We can actually make sure that the teachers themselves have the planning time they need to be able to do all these things that I would like them to be doing in their classroom. I want them to be able to apply the research on informed practice. And they can't do that with 45 minutes a day of planning time. It's impossible. And I'll use my example. My husband was in the oil industry, and he would have this stewardship meeting, that would come up in 3 months. So it was maybe an hour, maybe 2-hour presentation. I'm not sure the detailing of it. And he would work on that for 3 months. Okay. He'd take calls and do some other things, but basically that was the big thing. And so he'd have 6 minions running around doing view graphs, and all of a sudden, doing all the graphics and everything else with it as well. And we're expecting teachers that are doing 3 separate hours, let's say, of classes, or up to 5 a day, And we're expecting them to prepare quality experiences for those kids with 45 minutes a day. It doesn't make sense. But we don't value their capacity to do that. And where do the great teachers, they do it on weekends. They bust their backs just trying to get all the things done because they want to be the very best teacher they can. They want to apply all of these things we're learning about education and research, and they're burning out. And now and the more that the emphasis on testing is coming down on them, the more they're just saying, yeah, whatever. They're just giving up.
Yeah, they really are. And the reality is that we are, as a society, are taking less and less responsibility for being part of the solution and doing a whole lot of finger pointing. And I think that the sameness that you talked about is really a good recipe for micromanagement by administrators. So that kind of brings me back around to looking at this piece of being more of a coach and a facilitator and empowering the students, and how the experiences can help to shape a more positive school culture that might be energizing for teachers.
Well, and it's funny because the next book I'm writing in that series is about, I said, what about educators and responsible roles? Because one of the ways to give teachers more time to be able to learn about and apply the informed practices from peer-reviewed research is to give them other roles other than being in a classroom for 5 hours a day. And when I was a principal in Washington, D.C., we added a lot more teacher mentors to the system. And so what they got is I didn't want to take them out of the classroom. Like traditionally, all of a sudden you create this coach role and you take you take a great teacher out of the classroom. And they go into the classroom and they watch a teacher and they watch the interactions and then they have a chat with the teacher. But we said, no, we don't want to do that. So we said to my coaches that I inherited when I first went there, I said, well, I'm going to give you half a day teaching. And they just went, ugh, because the whole point, I guess, for them was to get out of the classroom. And that wasn't really the kind of coach that I would want anyway. So basically, they learned to go back into the classroom and they got to model the things they wanted other teachers to view. But then I gave them 3 to 5 teachers each as their mentor. So all after at mentees. So in the afternoons, they would spend 1 hour, let's say Monday, co-planning a lesson that they would co-teach with them the next day. Nice. So that meant my whole teaching staff was getting customized professional learning every single week.
How awesome.
So instead of having 2 coaches, now I had 8. And so then I sent the coaches I had 12 I sent to Harvard Project Zero to learn more about how to do project-based learning, because that was something this particular school didn't know as much about. And they came back incredibly empowered and very excited about, supporting others. So I really needed first, before I could sort of say, let's do all these great things with students, I needed the teachers to have some great things that they got to do. And these were some of the things I learned to focus on. I never thought I was going to write about the needs of educators, but I wrote a book on teacher shortages, and it has 15 things in there that teachers need. And I said, don't just throw them a bone and give them 1 or 2 of these things. You have to do them all. You want to keep teachers in the profession that are really worthy of being there for your kids. And you want to attract really good talent into the profession, then you need to do these things. And that's like, okay, if you've got 3 hours of lessons, then you need 3 hours of planning time. At least do 1-to-1. And I guess what that book did is it talked about how these things were actually done in schools. So when we designed 3 new schools, when I was involved in them, we really designed them around these needs of the teachers and the students. So it can be done. And people say, oh, what about the money? Well, then I wrote a book called How Much Does a Great School Cost? So I analyzed the budgets. And a lot of people love these line items in a budget. And they're like, oh, well, what are you putting in this year? And if you're repurposing your values of a school, you're trying to change the culture, which in other words is that, then the line items are going to have to change. If they don't change, you're just pretending. And so I think, I found a quote I put at the very beginning of that book, and the book I think is about 4 or 5 years old now, but I've had the quote for over a decade. And it was from Joe Biden before he was vice president. And he said, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value.
Yep.
And that's what opens up the whole book. So then I had examples of 4 different schools and their budgets and how they shifted their, the kinds of things they could do by repurposing their budgets. So one book will kind of lead to another book because people say, oh, you can't do those great things for teachers because you just don't have the money. And I said, well, wait a minute, hold on.
Let me tell you.
I had my own budgets from my own 3 schools and we made it happen because there's a lot of places where money is wasted. And there's a lot of opportunities for grants and so on, especially if you want to do innovative ideas. So we never felt a pinch. In fact, I think in most of I was always in the black by $300,000 or $400,000 every year. That even with giving, teachers 15, 16 kids in a classroom. So you can do it, but you have to not just as a school leader rely on somebody outside of the school to tell you what's going to be on those line items. You've got to say, no. I'm sorry if you don't have a nice little trend chart you could do because that little space isn't there anymore. However, that should not be what drives what's happening in schools. And it actually, I think it does drive quite a bit. And it's unfortunate, but you need to have some pretty bold people in leadership roles to shift, how funds are being allocated, for sure.
Yeah, that is a little disruptive. It's out of the status quo, and the type of change we're talking about is definitely not status quo. So tell me, because you've had a tremendous amount of experiences over lots of different schools and even different countries and all that kind of thing. As you went to implement change like this, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced?
I think the biggest challenge is time. And I'll give an example kind of where I have an experience that, is one of those memory makers. And I had to say, gee, which ones would I share? When I was opening the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy in Detroit, it's a high school, charter school there. We designed the curriculum so that we would have 10-to-1 ratio for English and math classes because these kids tested in supposedly at grade 3 or level, most of them. So we had quite a challenge when teachers would say, well, I've got to teach, quadratic equations. I was like, yeah, well, how are you going to do that without any knowledge of algebra and so on? And some kids, there were a few that were ready for grade 9 math and they were differentiated and they had it. But we had to really collapse a grade 3 to 5 program, collapse a 6 to 8 program, and then move them in within a couple of years by grade 10 to the program. Now, most of those kids did go on and get into colleges, and whether they all graduated from the colleges is another issue, but we definitely had our work cut out for that. But one of the things that I valued was social emotional learning, as I mentioned, and I said, every Wednesday afternoon, I've made arrangements with this local Baptist minister, a bus, and he was going to take all the students to a veterans hospital. And when they went there, their job was to build a relationship so that the students could write their biographies. And these students, they played cards, they did all sorts of things, but every day they took notes like a reporter about the person that they were connected with. And at the end, they published an anthology with all the biographies in them. But to me, that was much more powerful than writing an essay about a Shakespeare book.
Absolutely.
And that was an example. But what happened was when they were tested that first year, board kind of came along and said, oh, well, we came fourth in the city. Well, they didn't come last, but they came firmly to do that. So we need that time back. They need to do more language arts and more traditional courses in that afternoon. But it's over later, I think, since the school started. And guess what? They're still in fourth place. But the 9 years of students have not had that experience of forming those relationships with seniors in their community and writing something that really mattered. And when those kids talk about their overall experiences, sure enough, they remember that. And so time is the biggest challenge. And you've got the politics of people saying, who may not have any background, unfortunately, the trustees, not much background in education, and they react quickly. So if I was going to start a school again, I would say, you leave that, get that testing, get it out of here for 3 years. Don't come near us for 3 years. Let us really develop the application of what an ideal skill could be based on the research. But don't let the testing ruin it, because that's what happens. So they went back to doing more kind of like in the old days, we used to call things called SRAs. And you'd read a paragraph and then you'd answer multiple choice questions about it.
Yeah.
And most kids hated them, and they got rid of them for a while because we knew they weren't sound from a curricular point of view. But now, because they're aligned so beautifully with these standardized tests, they're come back in. And then it's like, oh, we can fix this. And as if the numbers that they can show on a single page dashboard is telling you a school's improving or a culture's improving. You're wrong, because you should see some other indicators in your community. Are the number of people entering prisons going down? What about the health figures? Like, we're not independent of that. So if our education was really contributing to society, there should be a lot of changes in the thing in other indicators than whether they were motivated to read about penguins when they're from inner city Detroit on a test. It just, it sort of baffles me. But to me, that's the biggest challenge. And why I write the books is to be able to show or tell stories about people who navigated around those challenges and the experiences that created. And even though that experience of being in the veterans hospital, when many of those vets never had anybody visit them for 5 or 6 years. To me, that's like really powerful. It's not soft. They had to write about it. They had to construct meaning. They had to make sense of some stories that sometimes they say, oh, there's some big gaping holes in the story. I need to go back and think about it. So they became reporters. They became writers. They became something other than a student taking a test.
It answers that age-old question, why do we need to know this? Why do we need to do this? And those are experiences that actually answer that question and create that lifelong learner that we need to be producing moving forward. And the testing system's not going to cut it. And honestly, you just gave me a whole bunch of great things. But my final question is that what would you like decision makers to know? And I know you've given me a bunch of them, but any final thoughts on that piece?
Yeah, I actually, when you told me this question in advance, I said, this is really, oh man, I could talk for hours, but I'll say 3 things. One is that I really hope decision makers will pay attention to stories of schools with students and teachers who are engaged. Pay attention to that. Learning is much bigger than test scores. So that's the first thing. Pay attention to the qualitative research. Because if you want a quality school, quality results, then you can't just narrowly look at quantitative results. So, and the second one, you can't force engagement. Can't force it, and you can't force learning. So what works at one school will not work at another school. And so the notion of replicating what this school over here is doing, because all those students might be from the same demographic background. And the idea of using words like accountability, delivery, training, these are clues to a system that wants a compliant society that basically will either answer to or buy products from or be under some other society that is a critical and thinking society. So we're actually creating a society with these, just because it's organized and it's easy to do and technology can make it happen, does not mean that that is actually going to lead to a society that, and of course, that's what made the United States, for instance, so incredible for so many years, because their graduate schools were second to none. There was so much innovation and so much excitement coming out of them. And now it's like, okay, they can't be creative until they get there. And then they're expected to be creative and come up with their own ideas. And now AI is saying, well, we can write your paper for you. It's like, wait a minute, what are we doing to grow their minds? And I don't think this direction will do. So that's my second point. And my third one is trustees, because they're at the top of the food chain in the public systems. They need to make it their responsibility to learn about informed practices. So I would, every time I meet a trustee, I says, well, what courses are you taking now? What do you mean? Well, no. Wait, are you taking about assessment? Are you taking about differentiation? Because you're making budget decisions and you're making personnel decisions and everything else based on this. You're choosing a director of education who you should know how to choose that person. And I would also say Ministry of Education and Department of Education officials, the same thing. Who's leading? Are they following the testing movement? And these should lead, but they should be informed leaders, and they need to get. Well, I really believe also that trustees need to make it their responsibility to really learn about informed practices, because they're at the top of the food chain. They have to hire the directors, and the directors have to be able to hire their lead teams as well in the administrative area that know about informed practices, not just operational practices, okay? Not just leadership administration. I'm talking about curriculum and teaching and learning. Like, what do we know? And if that requires more time, then the operational block scheduling isn't cutting it. It's not going to allow for the research and what we know about how kids learn and what kids are telling us in their stories about what's a memory maker for them, what makes them want to go deep in learning. We have to pay attention to that. And I think those things are missing. And I really hope that, whenever I come across a trustee, I'm going to ask them, what courses are you taking and what are you learning next? Because you shouldn't be expecting your students to learn, or the staff or anyone else that's involved in your school community and your organization, if you're not going to be a role model yourself.
That is such an excellent point. And for our American listeners, these are the school board people that you need to be talking to about what courses are you taking. That's really brilliant, actually, because they need to be learning what the research supports, as opposed to what might be out on social media or the trend in a political party or any of those kinds of things. So
exactly. That
is great. Gosh, I have enjoyed this conversation so much, and I really look forward to reading your books.
Thank you, Liz.
So exciting. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation too.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share with us and being on Education Perspectives.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Education Perspectives. Feel free to share your thoughts on our Facebook page. Let us know which education perspectives you would like to hear or share. Please subscribe and share with your friends.